Please be seated.
Yes, Mr. McCloskey. The next break will be scheduled for 12:30. Of course, you're free to ask to have the break earlier or a little bit later, should it be more convenient for you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. All right, I will now get into the sort of the briefest history to the lead up of the events that are in question. And I think it's first important for us to just take a look at the map of Bosnia. And that should be on the screen. Right now. As you can see, the area within the green is the BIH. Sorry, this is a little fuzzy on my picture, but and it's important to note Serbia off to the right of the screen, and the area in the pink is the Drina Corps zone of responsibility where these events largely occurred. It's important to see this area of I've referred to as Eastern Bosnia. It's also referred to as the Podrinja area or the Drina River Valley, but it's an important area. We could keep that screen up for me. It's an important strategic area for all sides. If we could get this, did the screen go off on everyone's or just mine? Well, in any event, the show must go on. So I'll continue. In the spring of 1992, the tensions inside and outside Bosnia are pretty extreme. The sides are beginning to form. And this particular area is of important strategic value. And to get an idea of its importance, both strategically and from an ethnic point of view, as this first and foremost, unfortunately, began as an ethnic conflict, I want to go to an exhibit from the 12th May 1992 Bosnian Serb Assembly called the 6 Strategic Objectives, and talk about them a bit. At this assembly hearing, the matters were discussed about moving populations and ethnic populations. And you can see from this directive the ominous tone that this war would take. And if we could blow it up to especially so we can see strategic number 1. And that is, and I'll read it slowly, establish state borders separating the Serbian people from the other 2 ethnic communities. Now, this is an outrageous thing to actually attempt to separate ethnic communities. And we'll see just how difficult that was. But they're right up front in this document, and they talk about it. So we see very early on that this war was going to be a war with ethnic motivations, relying on old ethnic hatreds, fomenting them. Then look at number 3, gives you an idea of how important this area was. Establish a corridor in the Drina River Valley, that is, eliminate the Drina as a border separating Serbian states. Now, you You saw the Drina River in the previous map. It was bordering on the Podrinja, or Drina River Valley. And so this would separate that and make this part a part of Mother Serbia, indicating this strategic nature of this area. Now, to give you an idea of the ethnic makeup and the ethnic foundation of this conflict, I want to quote you General Mladić's comments very briefly that he made at this assembly hearing that led to the promulgation of the 6 strategic objectives. He says, and this is after having some experience in the war of 1991 Croatia, people and peoples are not pawns, nor are they keys in one's pocket that can be shifted from here to there. It is something easily said, but difficult to achieve. And he goes on in another part. Therefore, we cannot cleanse, nor can we have a sieve to sift, so that only Serbs would stay, or that the Serbs would fall through, and the rest leave. Then he goes on and says, I do not know how Mr. Krajnik and Mr. Karadzic would explain this to the world. People, that would be genocide, unquote. General Mladić, of all people, forecasting the event, recognizing that moving people from their homeland, the Bosnian people, from the villages they lived in for centuries, was not going to be easy. It was going to involve bloodshed. Shortly after this meeting, the war in Bosnia, especially in eastern Bosnia, broke out in earnest. It began in the north, in the area of Bijeljina, worked its way south through Zvornik, Bratanac. These events in the spring of '92 were events notable for their terror and their attacks on civilian population. There were troops from Serbia, paramilitary and others that were involved in this. Not only were the Muslim forces routed, but the civilians, who were largely outnumbered, the Serbs, were shoved and pushed from their homes ever south, down towards the area of Srebrenica. Now the BIH in the early days fought back, being led by Nasser Oric and his own particular brand of horror, managed to make some inroads against the VRS. And in November of 1992, Mladić, Karadzic, made what I refer to as a supreme act of arrogance and impunity, and set out the plan to deal with the Muslims in eastern Bosnia. And if we could go to now to Operational Directive 4 of November 1992. And in particular, I'd like to blow up section D, page 5 of the English. And as we're doing that, I'll read it to you. There were some 9 directives done by Mladić and Karadzic throughout the wartime period. They were important documents. They were sent out to all the corps to outline their objectives, their strategies, and provide them the basic tasks by which they were to work. And if we go to page 5 here and look to the Drina Corps section, I will read the appropriate, the relevant part. The Drina Corps. from its present positions, its main forces shall persistently defend Visegrad, the dam, Zvornik, and the corridor, while the rest of its forces in the wider Podrinja region shall exhaust the enemy, inflict the heaviest possible losses on him, and force him to leave Birac, Žepa, and the Garajta areas. Now that's war, that's fine, that's what war is all about. Inflict the heaviest losses possible on the enemy and drive them out. But listen to this last sentence. After they want to inflict the losses on the enemy, force him to leave the Birac, Žepa, and Garajta areas together with the Muslim population. There it is, black and white, what Mladic had predicted in a secret document. It's called what we now refer to as ethnic cleansing. Move out the Muslim population. Black and white, there it is, unbelievable. Impunity. Now, as we know from historical fact, the VRS came fighting back. The Muslim forces were being beaten back, and in the spring of 1993, all was practically lost for the Muslims. They had been herded down in the area of Srebrenica, Žepa, and right as the VRS was coming in to make their final attack, General Morion stepped in with the United Nations and somehow stopped the onslaught, and the enclaves were created, for better or for worse. Now, the enclaves were supposed to be demilitarized. They never really were. The meager UN forces that were sent there tried. They were able to get, I think, a tank, the only tank that was known to have some of the heavier weapons. But the army, the structure remained intact inside the enclave. They had some automatic weapons, a lot of hunting rifles, and they were able to hold a ragtag military force together that led attacks outside the enclave. And so for the next 2 years, we have this situation where from the Muslim side, Nasser Oric and the BIH army are attacking outside the enclave, largely in order to tie down troops from other areas of the war and in part to feed themselves, because for the Serb side of it, they were cutting off the enclaves and restricting their humanitarian support. In the early years of this, we're not going to spend a lot of time in the case, but you will hear from 1 or 2 Canadian battalion members to talk about this. But this is not where our indictment starts, but it's important to have some understanding of that. By the time we get to July 1995, we actually see a Muslim document establishing the policy for the BIH army to attack the Serbs out of the enclave in order to tie down the Serbs from going to the Sarajevo front, which in 95 was the major front for the Serbs. And that's precisely what the BIH was doing. So there was some justification to go into Srebrenica by the Serb army and take out this threat. We'll get at that a little bit later. However, when we look at it, the overall objective, the motive to move out the civilian population, it's a 2-part plan. One that may have some legitimacy, and the other that absolutely does not. Now, I'd like to take you to another exhibit to take us a little more into July 1994. It's a report to the members of the Bratanac Brigade, which is stationed right to the north of the enclave. And it basically sets out the strategy on dealing with the enclaves. Now, remember, and we'll get into this in more detail, but you have the main staff, the corps, and the brigades. When you see a strategy like this from a brigade, it's not coming out of the origin of the brigade commander's head. This is the kind of thing that he will receive direction from above, and he will pass it down to his troops below. But in any event, the brigade that had most of the responsibility for Srebrenica, and if we could go to page 3, it's the last paragraph in paragraph 2 on the English. And as we get there, I'll read it. If we could blow it up so we can, especially with eyes that are not as young as they used to be, if we could blow it up a little more. But the relevant part says, "There will be no retreat when it comes to the Srebrenica enclave. We must advance. The enemy's life has to be made unbearable, and their temporary stay in the enclave impossible, so that they leave the enclave en masse as soon as possible, realizing that they cannot survive there." Again, we see the policy set out that will eventually lead to the attack on the enclave and gives us the foundation of why we see the sniping and the shelling and the restriction of the material, all of which is happening now, but will happen when our case starts as well in March of '95. Okay, if we leave '94, we get into March of 1995, specifically the 17th of March. I think at this point, all sides can see that the war won't be lasting forever, and that if gains are going to be made, they best be made this year. The Croatians were looking to the Bosnian Serb Krajina, and this was the major threat that everyone saw coming, as a massive Croatian front to the north. This is where General Milovanović was assigned for a good part of the year. So General Milovanović is not present during much of the time, and therefore not on our radar screen, though he is a very important figure in all of this. He was Mladic's top guy, and when Mladic had a most of the serious threat, he sent Milovanović there. He did that with his other generals too. He would send Guerrero to Srebrenica, to the forward command post. He sent Tolomir to the Žepa forward command post. This is how he commanded. Milovanović was way off in the Krajina during most of this, leaving General Militic to be standing in for the Chief of Staff. In any event, by this time, the Bosnian Serb Supreme Command and military understood that it's now time to solve the issue with the enclaves. If they're going to make them all Serbian, now's the time to do it. So if we could go to Operational Directive 7, dated 17 March 1995. Okay, and on that I'd like to go again to the Drina Corps section. And by the way, as you'll see at the end of this document, it was drafted by then Colonel Militic, accused in this case. I'll get into that a little more detail later when I get to some of the documents associated with General Militic in particular. But the part I want to particularly note to you, in the middle of the paragraph under the Drina Corps, it states, while in the direction, and I quote, while in the direction of Srebrenica and Žepa enclaves, complete physical separation of Srebrenica from Žepa should be carried out as soon as possible, preventing even communication between individuals in the two enclaves. Well, this is military. The Žepa and the Srebrenica enclaves were militarily supporting each other. Items were being flown in secret helicopter missions from the BIH Army, and creating havoc within the ranks of the villages outside the enclaves, and causing the VRS to tie down hundreds of troops around those enclaves away from the Sarajevo front, which was a crucial front. So this part of it is military and is legitimate. By planned and well thought out combat operations, create an unbearable situation of total insecurity with no hope of further survival or life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica and Žepa. Again, we're going directly to the civilian population, the inhabitants. There can be no doubt what this means. It's a follow-up on what we see throughout the historical period that I've been mentioning. Right there, in black and white, drafted by General Milicic himself. Now, that gets us to where our indictment begins. But before I get to those events, there's a few issues, military issues mostly, that I'd like to discuss that I think you need to have in mind as you look at the case. I would first tell you that by 1995, the VRS was a professional army. It was based on the rules and regulations of the JNA, which was one of the best armies and most professional armies in Eastern Europe. It had clear foundations from the Geneva Conventions. The training its officers received, by all accounts in my review of it, was excellent. Mr. General Pondorovich was trained in the Geneva Conventions, as were the other professional officers in this group. They knew the difference between right and wrong. They knew what they were doing. These rules of the former JNA were promulgated by the RS early on, and you can see those rules in Mr. Butler's report. They clearly set out the Geneva Conventions. They actually anticipate an international tribunal and show respect towards that. They had some good lawyers in the early days of the main staff. Unfortunately, that material, that foundation of the honor of the Serb soldier, was never followed, was cast aside. Once they took on the cloak of ethnic war, those that chose to take part of it set aside their honor and began a war against the populations of the Muslims. Now, they had a military prosecutor back then as well, and they promulgated guidelines for determining the criteria of criminal prosecution. If we could go to that. This is dated in 1992, and the part I want to show you in English is on page 7, the third paragraph down, and I'll read it slowly. I think it's that important. It's under a paragraph entitled Criminal Offenses Against Humanity and International Law, pursuant to Chapter 16 of the Criminal Code. Crimes against humanity and international law can be committed by individuals acting on their own, but by their nature, these criminal offenses are usually committed in an organized fashion in the implementation of the policy of the ruling circles. Witness O's organizers. Most of these criminal offenses are committed only during armed conflicts or are in some way closely connected with armed conflicts, which means that they are committed within the context of the broad military operations and on orders from superior officers. There's no way I could have or anyone else could have said it any better. And this is coming from the main staff. They go on to talk about the responsibility of a soldier, especially of those of commanders. And I'd go to the top of page 8. From this follows the explicit responsibility of the officer corps of the Army of Republika Srpska as the giver of orders in command of the armed forces, whose members could commit or are committing some of these offenses, to take uncompromising action and prevent such conduct. This responsibility belongs by its nature particularly to high-ranking individuals and officials in state, military, or public organizations who are in the concrete circumstances in a position to issue orders. These are commanders. Commanders are the only ones that actually issue or originate orders. In this case, General Vinko Pandorovich, Deputy Commander Lubomir Borovchinin. I'll talk about the powers and the ability to pass on orders and originate orders of the others soon. And we'll go on with this quote. If officers merely find out that units of the armed forces of the Army of Republika Srpska or their members have committed or are committing such acts and take no measures to prevent the consequences or the acts themselves and expose the perpetrators to criminal prosecution, this in itself makes them answerable for these criminal offenses. They don't prevent it, they're responsible for those criminal offenses. Does that sound familiar? Article 7.3. But this is much more than a failure to prevent case. And you'll see this from the facts. When Vinko Pandorovich arrives back to his brigade in the middle of the day on 15 July, there's still some 1,500 people left to murder. And when he comes back, he again is the man in charge on the ground in total command. The people of the Zvornik Brigade are acting under his command when he returns. Lubisha Beara is there, but he is not a commander. He has no power to command. He is what I've referred to before as an empty vessel. He is only as good as he is filled up by the orders of General Mladic, which he was. And he's carrying them out. He and the other security officers have to get their authority through their commander to obtain the troops and the other machinery necessary to get this job done. But when Vinko Pandorovich returns, he takes on command. He takes on the responsibility of what he absolutely knows is going on, and he knows it. The same holds true with Lubomir Borovchinin, who has told us in a statement to the ICTY that he was present at Kravica when the massacres were going on, and he did nothing. He took a man with burned hands.
Your Honor, I really hate to interrupt my learned colleague in giving his opening statement, but we intend to object to the admittance of Mr. Borovchanin's interview, and I believe it will be unfair to quote this in the opening statement.
Go ahead, and we will deal with the objection even when it arises. Thank you.
Mr. Borovchinin told the ICTY that he was at the Kravica warehouse while the massacres were going on. did nothing but take one of his officers who had burned hands to Bratanovs. After that, some 500 to 800, maybe more men were murdered. And his groups, his troops, were in control of that area and taking part in those murders. Much more than a failure to prevent. You have seen that we have charged in this indictment under a law that requires a commander in an area that he controls to protect prisoners of war. Not just his own troops, but from anyone that will do them harm. He failed in his duty to do that, therefore he's criminally liable. He's also part of the overall joint criminal enterprise, knew that this was a mass murder, that was part of an organized plan. You'll see his discussions with Krstić after this fact. You'll see other massacres that his troops were in. You'll see what his troops were doing in Popović. But I bring this particular section up because it's so important to these two commanders, directly to them. There's another significant rule that was promulgated by Krstić, which had much more importance than the rule I just mentioned. It's entitled The Interim Provisions on the Service of the Army of the Serb Republic, 18 August 1992. And it says, members of the Army shall carry out orders of their superior without demur, in full, accurately, and punctually. This is what won out in the day, though as I will discuss later on, General Pandurović and all the rest had received training that they had absolutely no obligation to follow criminal orders. In fact, it was a direct violation of their duty, their honor as soldiers, to follow such orders. They knew what they were to do. They were to stand down. All right, now if we could talk very briefly about the basic command structure, and if I could go to the exhibit chart for the main staff. Again, I don't want to get into details at this time. I leave that to the reports of Mr. Butler. And if you could try to blow that up so that we see the top half of it. Sorry, we're left in the electronic age, and basically this is a chart that puts Ratko Mladić as the commander of the VRS on the top. General Milovanović is his chief of staff. Now, he is the person that is in charge with coordinating the other areas of the command and making sure that the orders of General Mladić get carried out, and acting as General Mladić's main advisor. He's Mladić's right-hand man. He's not a commander, but he's close to it, and I'll explain how that works. The next boxes under the sheet, first of all, on the right, are the assistant commanders. Now, assistant commanders are high-ranking officers that are experts in particular fields. And for example, the fields that we're talking about, Ptolemir is intelligence and security, Guevara, legal, religious, and moral. And there are others, logistics. And then there are the staff officers, who are the staff of the chief of staff, and there's various branches within that. In particular, we have the operations department, where during most of this time we had Colonel Miletić and then General Miletić as the chief of operations. This job also held the position of a deputy chief of staff, and so in the absence of Milovanović, Miletić would take over. And as I mentioned, Milovanović was in the Krajina for a good part of this, and so the documents that we see throughout 1995 are largely in the hand of General Miletić, who is standing in for the Chief of Staff. Now, as I said, assistant commanders are experts in the field. What they do is they make proposals for the commander regarding their various fields. The commander reviews those proposals, makes his own orders based on them, and then it's the job of the assistant commander to facilitate the commander's orders, make sure they get done, make sure that it goes down through the chain and gets done. And fundamentally, while this is probably a very basic approach to this subject, this is the way it worked in the Corps and in the brigade. The fundamental difference is the main staff had very few people and only had a couple of units under arms, the 65th Protection Regiment and the 10th Sabotage Detachment being the ones that are most relevant to this case. Now, an assistant commander may pass on the orders of his commander, or he may issue, well, not issue, that's the wrong word. If you say that to a military man, he will grimace. He will make orders that are consistent with his commander's orders originally, and they get passed down through the ranks. He doesn't have the power to originate and issue orders. Therefore, he doesn't have the power to prevent people from committing crimes, because in order to do that, that's not backed up. He doesn't have that power. But he passes on the order of his commander, or he makes an order consistent with the order of his commanders, and it has the same effect as if a commander had made it, especially for the soldier or the officer that's receiving it on the other side. And you will see several examples of this happening. Colonel Beara cannot originate orders, but when he wants troops, he has to go, in this case, to General Krstić, asking General Krstić for troops, even though Beara is from the main staff. And you'll see this later on. Colonel Beara has to say, but Fertula, another brigade commander, is not following the general's orders, meaning Mladić. So Beara has power that is gained through his association and orders provided him by his commander, Mladić. And that's the way it works for all these guys down the line. Now, I mentioned briefly about General Miletić and his role. He was the operations, chief of operations. Now, the chief of operations is a person that is a hands-on guy involved in the operation, the military operations of the Corps and the brigade. So he is not a logistician and the more technical aspects of it. He is a hands-on guy and connected to these various operations. And so he is a key player in any military organization. And when he becomes standing in for Milovanović, try to explain what that means. There's a couple of different designations that the VRS had. They had acting, and they had, you could be an acting chief of staff, or you could be standing in for the chief of staff. Now, the basic difference to this is that when someone becomes an acting chief of staff, he's taking on much more of the cloak of that job. And that is in a situation not just in the mere absence or unavailability of the chief of staff. It's normally when that chief of staff is in the hospital or unavailable or has been dismissed or killed. And this person is standing in or excuse me, this person is acting and it doesn't have all the aspects of the job itself, because it's assumed to be temporary, but it is much more so than standing in. Standing in is when is something that happens in the absence of the person, such as when Milovanović is still in the army, still in Bosnia, still in communications. He's just far away, engaged up to his eyeballs with the Krajina. So that's the case where Miletić becomes standing in for the Chief of Staff and takes on many of his duties. In fact, almost all his daily duties. Milovanović can't do it. And you'll see what those are. So that's an important distinction to have in mind as you look at this. Now, commander. It's the same thing, though it's a little different in this situation. I'll use the Zvornik Brigade example. In the commander, we see that there is, first of all and foremost, the commander, who's normally present in command, on duty. Then there is the deputy commander, who at the same time is the Chief of Staff. Milovanović was the deputy commander at the same time he was the Chief of Staff, but he only became deputy commander when Mladić was absent or available, which was almost never, even when he was in Serbia, that was not absent. So we don't see Milovanović being deputy commander much. But if we go to the Zvornik Brigade, we see that Vinko Pandorović frequently goes out on military assignments. His Drina Wolves are the best attack group in the Drina Corps, and he's out on various duties, not infrequently. And we see from the evidence two things happening. Sometimes when he seems like he's gone on a more permanent basis or is fully involved in something well outside the brigade, Dragan Obrenović has become the acting commander, meaning that he bears almost the entire cloak of command, because Vinko Pandorović is unavailable to a significant degree. But in other situations, such as when we see Vinko Pandorović go down to take part in the attack on Srebrenica or the attack on Žepa, we see Dragan Obrenović designated as the deputy commander. This is what he takes on in the absence or the unavailability of the commander. Now, this is an important distinction, because the deputy commander, while in command of the troops on the ground and responsible for what's going on in his zone of responsibility, his commander is still in command of him and still has command responsibility. So when Vinko Pandorović is in Srebrenica, he does not give up his complete responsibility over his brigade. Basically, a deputy commander is trusted enough, as Obrenović was, to run the show and do the policies and get the job done as his commander had set the tone. Because this is temporary, that is possible. But the deputy commander is not one to originate policy or originate commands, and if something comes up where the deputy commander must originate or be creative or something outside the area of his commander, or something he knows his commander did not agree with, he will call his commander and check with him to make sure. And his commander is always available, always has a radio man with him, can get to a post. This war was not fought such that people are pinned down for days at a time out of communication. It gets a little crazier in the 15th and 16th, and we'll get into that in detail. But Vinko Pandorović was always by a radio, always near a forward command post, and always reachable. And in the context of his deputy commander would be contacting him when he had to. That's the basic rules that you'll see. Okay, the security branch. The security branch is just one of the expert branches under each of the, whether it be the main staff, the corps, or the brigade. And the security branch basically has two responsibilities, and it works for each one of them. They have responsibilities associated with law enforcement, where they're dealing with largely with the military police and enforcing the laws related to military conduct. And practically, a lot of this tended to deal with soldiers that left the lines, deserters, and rounding them up and making sure that the military police dealt with this properly, and that the military police were organized and acting according to the rules. Now, that's part of their job. They were not in command of the military police. The military police were under the command of the commander of the brigade or corps. The security officer was their director and their supervisor in very clearly established activities related to the military police. And the commanders would allow them to do that with full knowledge of what they were doing. And critical to this case is that military police are in charge of prisoners. So it's very natural that the dealing with the prisoners fell to the military police and the security officers. That's why you see all the security officers sitting here today. They were in charge of dealing with the prisoners. Now, they're not commanders, but they had orders from their commanders, and they were able to give orders pursuant to their commanders' orders, and they were able to direct and supervise the military police in carrying out those duties. And that's the way it worked. Now, there's another side of the security branch that you need to be aware of, because they have a two-part job. One, law enforcement. Clearly, they have to report everything to their commander. The commander knows what's going on. It's just like any normal situation. The second one is counterintelligence. And this is unique to this branch. A security officer has responsible for counterintelligence. Now, what does that mean? In this context, it mostly means threats from within, internal threats, threats against the command, threats against the army, soldiers being traitors, soldiers dealing with the other parts of the enemy, espionage. That's counterintelligence. Now, for counterintelligence, there are no troops. He has no men. It's him, basically, the security officer. Sometimes he'll get help from the intelligence officer. They work very closely in matters of intelligence and counterintelligence. That's why when you'll see that the intelligence officers are very closely related to the security officers and are wrapped up in this thing quite a bit themselves. So one is counterintelligence and one is law enforcement. Now, what goes along with the counterintelligence side are certain privileges that make the security job different than anyone else's. And that is because the security officer has the right to investigate the commander. He can receive information from his other security officers, the ones up the professional chain of command, secretly. And that's has been defined in the regulations. Drago Nikolic is allowed to get secret communications from Popović or Bajara that he can read and Pandorović cannot read. This drives commanders crazy. It drove Pandorović crazy because commanders want to know and be in control of what happens. But naturally, when a security officer may be investigating a commander or dealing with very sensitive information that may, if it becomes known to the command staff, infringe upon one of his counterintelligence jobs, then there's it's obvious a need for some secrecy for that to be carried out. Now, the regulations also clearly say they allow that, they understand that, but they say that when it is appropriate, the security officer must tell his commander what's going on. So the security officer may have an operation to ferret out a traitor, and he may not have to tell the commander what he's doing when he's going to go interview that person. But after the interview, when the thing is sorted out, he's got to tell his commander what's going on. And he's got to tell his commander he's going there. He can't just go to the front line to interview someone and show up. That would mess up the commander's ability to run a proper service. So this is a tension that we see throughout the VRS. It's a normal tension. Now, as we may see from the defense, we have seen commanders attempting to blame all the murders on the security branch and suggest that they're running the show, that they're in command. Well, this is impossible in the VRS regulatory scheme of things. There's only, 4 or 5 security officers for the entire Army, and they can't possibly run anything by themselves. They need to rely on the commanders for the men, the material, the troops, all that's involved in this mad mess. But when we get into this give and take between commanders and security officers, you'll need to have the basic understanding of how the system works. You'll hear that from the witnesses themselves. We'll go through it to the degree that it is necessary. At this point, I can't glean much from the defense briefs to see if this is necessary. In the past, it's been an important topic. As I mentioned, it's the job of the security officer to help direct and supervise the military police. In this case, under the main staff, this unit of armed men, the 65th Protection Regiment, designed to protect main staff assets, had a military police contingent to it. And as such, Beara had responsibility over them. Not command responsibility, but supervisory responsibility. However, going back to the practical aspect of this, you'll see a Dutch soldier, Egbers, who was in Nova Casaba on the 13th or 14th, and was introduced to Colonel Beara by the commander of the military police unit there at Nova Casaba, and the commander Malinich introduced Beara as here's my commander, Colonel Beara. Well, that's not technically correct, but from Malinich's point of view, what Beara said went, and you'll see that in practice. Popović, there was a Drina Corps military police unit that he directed. And the brigades generally got to know Popović because he's not far away in Vlasenica, and he made visits to the brigade. So the brigade military police commanders knew him and of course listened to him when he was working with their security officers. In the case of Zvornik, Lieutenant Drago Nikolic had the Zvornik Brigade military police company that he directed. And in Bratunac, we had Captain Momir Nikolic directing the military police company of the platoon of the Bratunac Brigade. Platoon meaning it's a smaller number of men, I believe in the area of 50. Company was supposed to be more in the area of about 200. I may have gotten those figures not exact at this point. Okay. Special police, an issue related to the special police that you need to be aware of. The Ministry of Interior is divided, roughly, it has armed forces, first of all. And their first line of armed forces were the special police, which were divided into regions. And these were some of the top people that originally trained in riot control and that kind of thing. And this is where Mr. Borovchinin was as deputy commander. Their units were basically combat units throughout the war that were assigned to work in combat areas. And when they were assigned with the Army, they became under the command of the Army, which I'll get into a little bit later. Additionally, the Minister of Interior had other combat units related to the police districts that were different than the special police districts. These are basically the civilian police districts, what is referred to as CSBs. Now, the CSB we're talking about is CSB Zvornik, which included most of this broad area that we're talking about. And the CSB Zvornik had many, many civilian police officers, traffic officers, detectives, of course. And in a time of war, it was only natural that those men were used when needed. So they had divided up the CSB into 6 potential companies. These were call-up companies. They were not always on the front line, but they were usually doing their job, doing traffic control or whatever, but in certain situations they would get called up and used by the Army or the Ministry of Interior. And these units we call the PJP units. So we have Borovchinin's special police units and the CSB PJP units. Now, the reason we use these initials PJP is very important, actually, is why I bring it up. The word in Bosnian that represents the letter P is translated in English as special. And so you'll see many documents with the special police of the CSB, and then you'll see special police of the Ministry of Interior, and it can get confusing. So, and that's just a problem of translation. In Bosnian, special police, the word is something, and forgive me, but something related to specijal. It sounds like special. The word that starts with a P, I've forgotten it, but it's different. And so this distinction has to be made. It'll drive the members of the MOOP as they're on the stand crazy if we mix this up. So we have to use these initials PJP for the municipal police, and we use special police for the special police. Sorry for that long instruction, but with these witnesses, it's very important. They obviously take it very seriously, as I know Mr. Borovchinin does. Now, another important area related to this is when the special police or the PJP units are assigned to a combat operation that the Army is in, the government of the Republika Srpska recognized that this created a problem of command. And so early on, they designated special rules that when this happened, that you had to get the approval of the Minister of Interior and the President. And once that happened, then the MOOP officers and MOOP soldiers became under the command of the Army that they were assigned to. Now, how did this work? This rule especially points this out, so that when Borovchinin is assigned by the Minister of Interior to go to General Krstić and report to him in Bratunac on the 11th of July, he becomes under the command of the Army. Now, I don't have the President's approval of that, but we do have the evidence to show you that that's what's happened. And the way that works is Borovchinin takes his orders from the Army, but the rules also clearly set out that the MOOP commanders retain command, and their command chain stays the same. So you don't have an Army guy going behind Borovchinin's back and giving an order. The rules are Borovchinin gives the orders, they go down through his chain of command, he receives them through the Army. Now, of course, in the practical battlefield, things don't always work out the way as planned, but that's the way the rules work, that's the way they tried to make them work, And that's the way they did work. Feels like you've been listening to me for a long time, and that this information is not the easiest to listen to. I now am it's time to go into chapter 2. I don't know if
Yes,
you want me to keep talking or make
It's
a
up,
break.
it's up to you, Mr. McCloskey. We're certainly not going to stop you. I previously told you that the next break was scheduled for 12:30. In reality, I think we are to stick to the hour and a half schedule. It should be at 12:15 or thereabout. So please regulate yourself accordingly, I mean, according to your exigencies. Whenever you need to stop, we'll give you the opportunity to do so.
Thank you. This is a natural stopping point, and I don't think people should have to listen to me for more than 45 minutes at a time.
Right. Then we'll have a 20-minute break starting from now. Thank you.
Thank you.
All rise for full fit.